And do you see a difference between a revival that happens at a church? For me, it was, the revival happened in my living room. Then we went to a building. We were there for 10 years, but I was a part of, God used me to spark a different revival in Arizona that's been going on for now about 7 years at a church called Fresh Start Church. It's an amazing move of God happening there. Both of those were in a church type setting. Of course, one started in my living room. Do you see a difference in revival in the church? And then is it possible people watching this say, what about having personal revival where God awakens a person, where God does something supernatural or suddenly in the life of a person, and then revival sparks in their life and they're reaching people, they're praying for people, and they're starting to see people gather, maybe in their living room, maybe in their home? Or is it always in history starting in just like a church building or on a Sunday morning? What are your thoughts on the differences of like when revival and how revival sparks?
If it's real revival, you're going to see it outside of the church building. It may start in a church service. Many times it has, as believers have gathered together. But even that, it will go back to an individual where something ignites in that person's life, a hunger, a thirst, a desperation, a groaning, a crying, a seeking God. You feel like it's never going to happen. You feel like you're losing your mind. You feel like you can't live another day without the breakthrough. And it may ignite inside a church building. But then you'll see the results when the people leave the building. Many of the greatest testimonies that we heard during the Brownsville revival in Pensacola, Florida, were people who came to the meeting and thought, okay, I was there for the week and I went to every service and stood online all day outside waiting to get into the meeting. Or the lines would begin to form at 6 a.m. This went on for years. Wow. People came from 130 nations, cumulative attendance of about 3 million people. More than 300,000 different people responding to the altar calls just in one local church. Wow. So people would get on at 6 a.m. They'd stand online 12 hours for the doors to open at 6 p.m. Then the service would start at 7 p.m. and it would go about 5 hours, sometimes longer. This was most nights of the week for years. And we'd hear people say, I came, I was blessed, I enjoyed the meetings, I was expecting more. And then on the plane flying home, the Spirit visited. Or in the car driving home, the Spirit visited. We get pictures, youth groups came and they'd pack a few vans and they'd send us a picture. God was moving. They were just praying hours and hours as they're driving home. And they'd get out at the parking lot, stretch their, at the gas station, stretch their legs, get some gas, get something to eat or drink. And they'd send us a picture, all the bodies laid out in the parking lot. They got out just to walk and the power of God fell on them there. In the early months, especially of the revival in Pensacola, the youth pastor started getting calls. It started in June, so now the fall comes, and many, many young people have been dramatically touched, and they would go to school. So they've been touched by God. They've been radically saved. They've been transformed. They show up at school, and now it's Monday, and they're sitting in class, and the power of God would fall on them in the classroom. And the kid would literally fall out of the chair on the floor, shaking, and no one knew what was happening, and they couldn't talk. They were just overcome. So there's a panic. What's going on? They bring him to the nurse's office. They can't find anything the matter. And maybe the kid gets one word out, Brownsville. And they started to piece it together. Wait, that must be that church. And they would call the youth pastor angry until they started to see the kids getting transformed. Wow. Some of the worst kids in the school getting transformed, getting touched. And they realized God's doing this. I actually sat down in October of 97, so 2.5 years into the revival.
I sat really down quickly, for those maybe brand new about Brownsville, maybe I know you're giving an overview, but maybe for those listening that are brand new, tell us what Brownsville is. That was a church in Florida, is that right? For maybe the new listeners.
Yes, so Brownsville was a small neighborhood in the city of Pensacola, Florida. So there was a church there, Brownsville Assembly of God, a good church, maybe 1,500 people, had a local TV ministry, outwardly successful in their new building. But the pastor, John Kilpatrick, knew something's missing. There's got to be more. There's got to be more. He would go in the building alone at night and groan and cry out. And God said to him, if you turn this into a house of prayer, I'll send revival. Wow. So Sunday night was a big preaching night there in the South. They canceled Sunday night services. And every Sunday night, they would just gather for prayer. And they would cry out for God to move. And they would cry out for revival. And then Steve Hill, a colleague of mine, he was a missionary in Argentina. He was back in the States. He himself a passionate evangelist and revivalist. And both Steve and I were close with Leonard Ravenhill, author of the classic book, Why Revival Tarries. That's how we connected. Steve was in just to preach one day, and the fire fell. And it lasted roughly 5 years of God moving with intensity. We raised up a ministry school in the midst of it. We had almost 1,200 full-time students Many people dramatically touched in the revival went to the school. Some of them now been on the mission field for 25 years. I mean, I can introduce you to one young man, married with kids, was an alcoholic binge drinker, came into the Tuesday night prayer meeting. The presence of God was so strong just in the prayer meeting. He got radically born again at the prayer meeting, came to our ministry school. He's been in the Philippines now almost 25 years. I could tell you the stories. You hear them and you think it's a myth. You think it's just tall tales. But I know people who know the people that there were these two Playboy bunnies in Pensacola for a photo shoot on the beach. And it was hurricane-like weather, canceled the photo shoot. So they had a free night. They hired a taxi and they said, "Where's the action in Pensacola?" So he brought them over to the church.
Come on.
And they thought, what, church or whatever, this will do something crazy. They go in there, the end of the night, they're weeping and shaking. And it got the pastor's attention, like, what's going on? He went and talked to them and they said, we haven't lived the best lives. And they said, we feel like God's shaking the hell out of us. They get radically born again. One of my colleagues knew one of the ladies for years. They moved back down there, became a solid disciple. One woman, when she joined the church, we heard her testimony. She was driving by the building one day with no thought of God in her mind whatsoever. She was driving by the building. Suddenly, the presence of God came in her car. She became overwhelmed with a deep sense of sin, cried out to God, and was born again as she drove by the building in her car. Wow. I can think of one young woman. Her mom convinced her to come, maybe 17, 18 years old, named Tina. Her mom convinces her to come. Let's go to Pensacola. We can go to the beach and all this. Her mom wakes her up 5 a.m. Come on, we got to go to church. She goes, what are you talking about? Go to church. I'm here to go to the beach. No, we're going to go to church today. Why are we getting up at 5 a.m. to go to church? What time does the service start? 7 p.m. What are we doing?
Wow.
So she gets up with her mom, not a believer, right? Feeling tricked and upset. Now stands on the line for 12 hours in the Pensacola heat to get into the service, gets radically born again, comes to our school and ends up serving as a missionary in Tanzania for several years.
Wow.
I mean, you see this. And Isaiah, like I said, the stories of people. I preached in New Jersey, and this was a few years into the revival, and the pastor said, you need to hear our story. And they were in a church that had had a steady move of God for the last 2 years. And when I got there, you could see the Spirit was still moving. They said, we went down, 5 of us on the pastoral team. We went down to Pensacola. We were in all the meetings. We were prayed for at the end of the services. We responded to the altar calls. We enjoyed the meetings, but we were expecting more. Well, now they get on the plane to fly home, and they had to go from Pensacola, which is a regional airport, into Atlanta, which is barely a half-hour flight, and then from Atlanta to New Jersey. Well, they had 5 tickets that were supposed to be all next to each other on the plane, but when they got on the plane, they realized, what happened? We're all separated. The pastor, to his shock, as he's sitting alone and the plane takes off, the Spirit falls on him on the plane. Not in the building, not with the crowds, not with the singing and the preaching and the laying on of hands. Alone on the plane, he's visited by God and weeps the entire way to Atlanta, gets off the plane. He can't wait to tell his other 4 friends, only to find out it happened to all 5 simultaneously, wow. Separated. They went from there into a service and the Spirit fell. And 2 years later, God was still moving. This is the kind of stuff that happens in the midst of revival. One guy comes in. His dad was an Assembly of God pastor, a Pentecostal pastor. He was in a gay relationship, a same-sex relationship with another man. He heard what was happening in the church, and he was so angry and hateful towards it. I heard this from a colleague that knew the man personally. He comes into the building angry. I don't know what he's planning on doing, but he's just angry, and he's going to see what's happening in this service. He walks into the building and gets overcome by the Spirit and falls out in the vestibule on the way into the building. The ushers, he's just laying there, so they pick him up and carry him and lay him at the altar where he stays the entire service. Wow. And then ends up getting born again at the end of the night. And my friend said, he broke up with his boyfriend, and I knew him for years. He was a solid disciple. These are the kind of things that happen. And Isaiah, when I would travel out, I would see the same things that were happening in Pensacola would happen on the road. It would happen in other countries I'd been to many times and see good meetings. Now everything was amped up, and we would have these divine suddenlies of God just breaking into a meeting and things that had never happened in the region just happening. And when I talk about these things, It's awesome. It's glorious. But what I remember most was the presence. The Jesus was there. It was so real. And as my heart is burning and believing and expecting for something to spread all over America, I know it's happening in early stages. I'll say this last thing. Last year in January, towards the end of January, I got on the air in my daily radio show and I said, listen, I've known this for some months now, but I need to say it. As I travel around America and I'm seeing God moving here and here and here, it's the early stages. I said, but I'm telling you, the first wave of the next revival has come. We are in the early stages of the first wave of the next revival. And then about 8 days after that, the Spirit fell at Asbury. And now the whole country was talking about revival. And I got back on the air. I said, look, I'm telling you, something has started. But this time, it's not just going to be one place like Brownsville or Toronto or Asbury where everyone's flocking. That's why the Asbury meetings ultimately were shut down to the public. It wasn't God's purpose to everyone flocking to one place. I said, I see thousands of holy fires that are going to be burning all over America. That's why we published the book, Seize the Moment, to say, okay, when God comes, what do we do? Wow. When God comes, how can we work with God to not cut the move of God short? It's so urgent. It's so critical that we seize this. We can pray for a generation for God to come and then chase the Spirit away when he does. So something's happening. God's going to be touching thousands of people and hundreds of leaders who've never experienced revival before. And we want to help equip them and get them ready. So I'm grateful for the past, but I'm not living in the past.
Come on.
The past just builds my faith for something greater today.
That's so good. And as you're saying that, man, I have chills the whole time. I'm saying, Lord, in my head, do it again, Lord. We need a move of God. We need an outpouring of the Holy Spirit.